Welcome back to another episode of Stack Racks TV, Stack Rack Boxing. We talk boxing on this channel. From time to time we talk shit, but, the main purpose, principle, prerogative of this channel, right, is to sit back, slack jack, and Mac Jack and Jack. You dig what I'm saying? Today, we talking about Floyd Schofield Jr., y'all. Floyd Schofield Jr., Abdullah Mason. I recently ran a poll on my channel. Y'all go check out my polls. I post polls very often, just to keep fans, subscribers, up to date in the sport. See what people thinking in the sport, right? So I recently ran a poll on Abdullah Mason and Floyd Schofield Jr., and you'll be surprised by the numbers, right? A lot of people don't believe that a guy like Floyd Schofield Jr. can beat a guy like Abdullah Mason. Primarily because Abdullah Mason is obviously more active. He's fighting a better competition. And Floyd Schofield Jr. only fought one time in 25. And that was against a guy by the name of Tevin Farmer, who right now is sitting at 9 losses. Abdullah Mason right now is one of my favorite young fighters. I love a fighter that loves to be active, that likes to step up and take the best challenges possible. Guys looking for that goal. The opportunity to be champion, reign as champion, and their goal is to stay champion, right? He's one of those guys, again, tall for the weight class, long arms, has the ability to box, but, he's susceptible to being tricked to fighting down to the level of his opponents. He can go in there and box a lot of these guys easily, especially with his reach advantages, his height advantages. But, you catch Abdullah with a shot, he want to brawl. And you fix that in the sport by, staying active, getting better from training camp to training camp, watching film on yourself, right? I can see a guy like Floyd Schofield Jr. taking advantage of Abdullah Mason's defensive irresponsibilities in there. Schofield Jr. is a guy who likes to fight in the exchange. He's throwing heavy, hard shots in the exchange. We've seen Mason get caught fighting on the inside against a guy that's not as talented as Floyd Schofield Jr. Floyd Schofield Jr., people underestimate, his ability to close the gap. He is young. He is fast on his feet. He does have the opportunity to catch a guy, especially when that guy abandons his game plan when he gets caught by a big shot, right? So I understand the sentiment. Abdullah Mason, especially if he was more of a well-rounded boxer, a guy that fought his game plan from 1 to 12, that fought his game plan on the back foot, using a jab, keeping the guy at bay, exchanging when he wants to, and keeping the guy coming forward without being successful. I could see Abdullah, winning an easy fight like that. But unfortunately, Floyd Schofield Jr. is one of those guys who's able to counterpunch the counterpuncher. But the difference is every shot that Schofield Jr. throws is hard, right? Abdullah Mason is a guy, right, has all the talent in the world, but, he's not the best boxer right now. He's not that great at controlling the ring. He's not great at following a game plan to a T. And I could see a guy like Floyd Schofield Jr. taking advantage of that. Don't get me wrong. I would have Abdullah Mason in that fight. I like boxers. I like boxers who can brawl as well, right? Abdullah Mason checks all the boxes for me except, his defense. Right? He's defensively irresponsible. But I feel like if he tighten up on that, he's able to box, move around the ring a little bit more, use some of that real estate in there, right? Stick to his game plan, not get tricked to fighting on the inside. I believe he could beat a guy like Floyd Schofield Jr., right? Abdullah Mason is active. He's active. He's looking to fight the best available opponent. And like I said before, that's what I love in a fighter. On the contrary, we got Schofield. Every time he get a step-up fight, to really show the world what he could do at a high level, he get bed bugs. Somebody done got rabies. Somebody done broke in the crib. Somebody done held him really hard to pick a guy like Schofield Jr., based off the inactivity. We seen ring rust, hurt a lot of fighters in the sport of boxing, right? And Floyd Schofield Jr. last performance against Tevin Farmer, Tevin Farmer was on a losing streak already. He had already been losing, right? So it's hard to gauge that, especially that we didn't get to see Floyd Schofield Jr. show us much of anything because the fight ended so fast. It remind me of Edgar Berlanga, prior to him fighting Canelo and Shiraz, right? He was knocking everybody out. You know, he wasn't going the distance with nobody. Everybody he got in there with, he made easy work of them. He dismissed them. But once we started seeing him have to go the distance against guys that had talent, we see what happened, right? And Floyd Schofield Jr. is no different. As it pertains to both of these guys right now in their career, I would have to go with Abdullah Mason. You know, the guy that's more active. You know, the guy that's looking to be more active. You know, Floyd Schofield Jr. is just not as active as he should be to even take on a fight like that, right? But don't get me wrong. If Floyd Schofield Jr. was more active, he fought more, he was willing to step up in competition, you know, it'll be a very tough fight, you know, because Floyd Schofield Jr. can catch Abdullah Mason and he can hurt him.